Ash Sarkar describes herself as a communist, which we discuss in the interview, and is a contributing editor at left-wing media site Novara Media. We also talk about her support for the former Labour leader, her relationship with the party now, and the tone of debate on Twitter, where she's faced terrible abuse. This is the backstory from Tortoise. Ash Sarkar, you told Piers Morgan that you were, quote, literally a communist. What do you mean by communist?
What do I mean by communist? I think that means that everything that we need as humans to survive should be collectively owned, collectively managed, and that we should have access to them on the basis that we have a right to them rather than simply we've been born into a fortunate enough position to be able to afford them. I don't believe that markets are the most efficient method of distributing resources. And I think that one way in which we see that is with the climate crisis. And I think collective stewardship, particularly in this age of climate crisis, to me, it looks like our way out.
Very few people opt to be communists these days. Why have you? What's propelled you in this direction? Who propelled you?
Who propelled me? I suppose it started when I read Black Skins, White Masks by Frantz Fanon. It was a book that my mum gave me, and she gave it to me because she wanted me to be able to understand life as a person of colour. And as you read Fanon, there are words like lumpenproletariat, and I didn't know where it came from. So I then got my hands on a copy of the Communist Manifesto. And I was a teenager at this time, so I must have been like 13, 14. And the impact that the Communist Manifesto had on me was exactly the one that Marx and Engels intended. It's this phenomenally rousing text. You know, it's very gothic, it's very dramatic. And I was like, my God, this makes a lot of sense. And then I got to uni and I started thinking about it, not just in an emotional way, but in a more rational way. And it made sense for me of why democracies are so weak in the face of capital, why our media is the way it is. This idea of base and superstructure I found really compelling as an analysis. And yeah, it made sense to me on both an emotional level and as a way of making sense of the world I lived in.
It makes you, though, an outlier to have these views. Why now do so few people follow the route you have?
Well, the reason why so few people follow the route that I have is because communism was largely defeated by the time you get to the 1990s. One, you've got communist parties across the world either being massacred or discredited or forcibly broken up. Two, you've got the fall of the Soviet Union. Of course, that's a huge deal. And what you're left with are these sort of, rump authoritarian states where it wouldn't be very nice to live. The exception, of course, being China, which is a sort of, state capitalist bureaucracy in its own way. And so the utopianism and the romance of communism really, was diminished by that. And in terms of being an outlier, I really don't mind that. I think it would be very boring if everyone just had to judge their opinions according to where they think the crowd is.
So am I right in assuming from what you've said that you consider yourself a Marxist?
Would I consider myself a Marxist? In lots of ways, yes, but I think there's sometimes a tendency to look at Marx as something of a prophet, and you have to adhere to the revealed word of Marx and not think about the thinkers who took his work forward. Like I said, Frantz Fanon is, of course, really important to me because he takes this idea of the lumpenproletariat, looks at it through the lens of colonialism. Gramsci, for me, is really important of how you make sense of what goes on in Western liberal democracies. Stuart Hall, then, for the cultural component.
The British philosopher.
Yeah, the British cultural thinker. So all of these thinkers, you trace it back to Marx, but they are doing things with Marx's thought that Marx doesn't get to grapple with.
Do I take it from what you said earlier, then, that your version of communism still involves the abolition of private property?
Well, I would say in terms of the abolition of private means of expropriating things which should be collectively owned, managed and stewarded. Not in terms of you can't own pieces of furniture or you can't own your home.
You could own your home.
Yeah, I think that home ownership,
even a big one.
Well, put it this way. I think that the demise of council house building, the introduction of right to buy, it's made the housing market worse for everybody. I think having a mixed housing economy would be quite a good thing. Ultimately, it means that home isn't what it is now, which is this sort of, bubble of asset price appreciation. It's doing something different. But I've got no beef with private ownership of a home if it means that homes are available to everybody.
But you said earlier that you wanted the collective provision of everything.
I'd say the collective stewardship of everything. And that doesn't mean that you don't have some level of private property. But ultimately, you've got the state being responsible for making sure that you've got the supply side covered, where private ownership isn't getting the job done.
Would the state own the media?
Would the state own the media? Now, this is something which I think is really important. I believe in state regulation in the sense of things like Ofcom, Impress. I really do believe in that. I believe in state-funded public service broadcast. But state-controlled media, no.
But wouldn't the state own the media?
Not necessarily, no. I mean, you do have models of communism where you've got rooms for things like cooperatives, right? And Novara Media, for instance, we're effectively a co-op. We've got a flat pay structure. If the, media organisation goes bust tomorrow, it's not, the two directors who get everything.
But you have that in a capitalist society.
We have that in a capitalist society.
Where is there a Novara in a communist society?
Well, hopefully you'll see in 20 or 30 years.
But where has there been?
Well, the thing is that you have had, obviously not in, Soviet Russia where you have an incredibly tightly controlled media environment, but you have had in, of course, Catalonia, you had a hugely radical independent press as well during the Spanish Civil War. You had some really interesting experiments with radical left-wing and in some ways hostile to the communist governance at the time in Bologna. You had the autonomous media, which is what we're modelled on. I'm not looking for top-down state control of everything. What I'm looking for is collective custodianship, which does involve things like cooperative ownership. I would be very uncomfortable with the state owning or controlling all media. But I also, and I think this is the, reverse back to you Uno card. I don't think in an environment where you've got over 3/4 of the newspaper circulation being controlled by 4 billionaire families that we do have a free press. I think in some ways we've got an entirely constrained and restricted press.
To get to where you want to be with your kind of communism, do we have to go through the dictatorship of the proletariat?
I'm going to be honest with you, I don't know. I go through this.
We might.
I go through this all the time where I think about democracy versus command and control, because I do believe there is something inherently emancipatory about the democratic process, democratic freedoms. That's where very much, I'm not a Leninist and I'm certainly not a Stalinist and I'm not a Trotskyist. I believe that the democratic process is important. But how you form that counterweight to capital and how you deal with the brute force of the capitalist state. This is, of course, stuff that Gramsci thinks about at length and is working through in the prison notebooks. My answer to that is a big old I don't know.
One of the things Marx advocated strongly was what he called revolutionary terror, which is part of the dictatorship of the proletariat. And most of those who formed governments based on Marx's doctrine were pretty keen on revolutionary terror. They carried it out. Lenin, Stalin, Mao, Pol Pot.
Well, of course, the origins of the phrase revolutionary terror come from the French Revolution and Robespierre. Have you read A Place of Greater Safety by Hilary Mantel?
No.
It's a beautiful novel, one of my favourite novels. And she's really grappling with this question of revolutionary terror, the desire to keep the revolution going in the face of all enemies and whatever, and also balancing against human life. And she's got a line which I think gets right to the heart of the contradiction, which is, what is one life in the grand scheme of things? Nothing. Of course, it means everything to its possessor. And for me, when it comes to this question of political violence, whether that is the revolutionary political violence that you're talking about in terms of Marx, whether you're talking about emancipatory political violence, which is what Frantz Fanon writes about in The Wretched of the Earth, for me, there is this stubborn idea of the sanctity of the human life, which I find hard to collapse or wave away in terms of, the revolutionary impulse.
But isn't that in conflict with all that we know about communist real-life experience, where the sanctity of human life is often the last thing that matters?
But I would say that the sanctity of human life under the system we have is often the last thing that matters.
Really? Where are our gulags?
Where are our gulags? Well, we offshore them. I mean, this is the thing about capitalist societies, is that we can have our lovely European social democracies, but what goes on in Libya and at the borders of Fortress Europe is absolutely horrendous. When you look at the conditions for people working in coltan mines or coal mines or child labourers in India, what we do with global capitalism is we say, oh, we've got a lovely society here, but over there in the hinterland, in the periphery, it is absolutely, stained with blood.
So a textile factory in Sri Lanka paying very poor wages and turning out clothes that we in the West buy cheaply, that's the equivalent of a Stalinist gulag?
I'm not saying that they're equivalents. I'm saying that capitalism absolutely churns through human life. And if you want to measure body counts, and this is the interesting thing which Amartya Sen does in his work on famines, you end up with an astonishingly high death rate from famines in a democratic and liberal India after independence. Absolutely grotesque.
Higher than Stalin's treatment of the kulaks?
Well, that's the research that Amartya Sen comes out with, and Chomsky says if you apply the same methodology from the Black Book of Communism to India, you end up in one country alone with a higher death count.
But famines have happened in the non-communist world because of climate issues, because of government incompetence, because of over-farming, because of distribution issues. Famines have happened in communist regimes through direct, intentional economic policy.
But I think if you were, again,
Isn't that true?
Look at the colonial era, yes, but I would also say the same has happened in the non-communist world. If you talk to somebody from Ireland and you talk about the Great Hunger, they would say this was an intentional British policy.
But that's
if you talk
not
to
true.
If you talk to people
But it's not true.
about the Bengal famine, well, yes, you had the turning away of certain grain ships. You only had relief coming in towards the end.
There's two different issues here. The causes of the potato famine in the 1840s and the British government's response to it, which everyone agrees was wholly inadequate. But the cause of it was not it was not intentional British government policy to starve the Irish to death.
But you did have the continuing exports of grain from Ireland during the potato blight. You also, and again, I know I'm talking about Amartya Sen a lot.
That's a response. It didn't cause it.
But in terms of the impact of deaths, then yes, it did cause the deaths, if not the blight itself.
I mean, given that every time people with your views come to power, and the result is the same, which is authoritarian dictatorships and economic squalor, why do you keep going back to the same thing?
Well, I would also differ with the idea that every time communists come to power, you do have economic squalor and authoritarianism.
Well, give me an example where that hasn't happened.
Kerala. So Kerala has had communist regional and local governments for absolute decades now. And compared to the rest of India in terms of its literacy, healthcare outcomes, it does an awful lot better.
But it's not a communist society.
But it's communist governments.
Yeah, I understand that. Well, Bologna has had communist governments, but it's not a communist city.
Well, no, Bologna, I'd also say if you go back to the origins of Novara Media, we're very much against that tradition of...
I understand that, but there's a world of difference between local government being run by communists within a capitalist or a non-communist nation state and a communist nation state which controls all the levers of power. Now, when that has happened, where's the success story?
But I'm saying that there isn't one form of communism, right?
But give me any.
This is a long and rich political tradition of which the Leninism and Maoism is just one part. And I do not associate myself with Mao. I do not associate myself with Lenin.
No, but I'm trying to find any example of when a nation state has ended up following the route that you wanted to, that it's been a success.
The thing that I'm saying is that I think the capitalist society that we have, the trajectory that the world is on in terms of climate change in particular, I think that in 40 years' time we'll be looking at that and go, well, why did we prioritise the market above all else? Why did we trust the market to get us out of this when we could have had collective ownership, collective stewardship, which have allowed us levers, which would have solved this problem?
Except that it just results in poverty. Could I suggest that every country that moves to some form of market economy, and like your versions of communism, there are many versions of the market economy as well. Singapore is very different from Sweden, for example. Britain is different from America. France is certainly different from America. But they're all versions of the market economy. Every country that adopts that approach ends up with rising living standards, rising educational standards, less poverty, and rising per capita incomes. Every country. Whereas communism is the opposite.
So I take issue with that. I really do take issue with that. I think you're completely right to say that there are lots of different visions of a market economy. I think you're completely correct to say that.
But they all work better than communism is the point I'm putting to you.
No, I'm not. I entirely disagree with that.
Give me examples of where a communist society has performed better than a market economy.
So here's one thing which I think, and again, this is about climate change. If you
No, I asked you the question.
No, I'm answering your question.
Where has there been a communist society that has operated better than a market economy?
Okay, I think that on certain metrics, Cuba has operated better. Now, it hasn't been on GDP, but if you want to look at healthcare outcomes, Cuba, compared to other Caribbean nations, has done much better, right? Much, much better. I know that you don't like the Kerala example, but for me, that is really important.
I think the Kerala example is very interesting. I'm not arguing with that. I'm just saying that communists getting in charge of regional or local government is not the same as them running a nation state. That was my point there. I accept your example of that.
And then the third thing that I'd want to say, and this is about looking towards the future, I think that China is obviously a bad, polluting country at present. But when you look at their ability to build infrastructure, when you look at things like high-speed rail, and then if you look at the pace at which the decarbonisation is going to happen, I think that they're in a much better position to decarbonise very quickly than, America.
They're building a new coal-fired power station every week.
I'm not saying that they're not bad polluters. They absolutely are.
But you just said that they're leading to decarbonisation.
No, I'm saying if you look at their ability to decarbonise quickly.
But they're not.
Once they hit peak coal. No, I'm not saying it's happening now, but I'm saying their ability to do that, I think, is greater than America's ability to do that.
But America's already substantially decarbonised by moving from coal to gas.
Moving away from gas and getting rid of,
but that could
fracking
well be
in
the
Montana.
Next stage.
I mean, look at.
I don't understand
American
how
rail infrastructure. Rail infrastructure may as well be in the 19th century.
I understand that America has major infrastructure problems, which Mr. Biden is so far without huge success trying to address. I don't understand how anybody, though your colleague at Novara could argue that China's in the vanguard of decarbonisation.
No, I'm not saying it's the vanguard of decarbonisation. I'm saying if you want to project 20, 30 years in the future where I think that every single nation state on the planet is going to go, oh my God, what have we been doing all this time? And you're going to have to pull the levers to wean yourself off fossil fuels very, very quickly. Which country is going to have the ability to do that rapidly? I think it will be China.